Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We are a year-round talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, and theater. And I'm so thrilled today to be joined by the fantastically talented director Sam Feder, who directed the Netflix documentary Disclosure. And one of the things that I was so fascinated about in watching this and learning more about your journey in making this is, this film was several years in the making process and was a 5 or 6 year journey on your part. But throughout that time, if you really think about the difference in representation and the way that the media has covered the trans community throughout that time, it's been a continually evolving conversation, even just within the last 2 months, the last 6 months. And so I was really fascinated about how that presented a unique challenge for you as a filmmaker, creating a documentary that felt very timely, but also was part of such an evolving conversation throughout that time.
Yeah, that was definitely on our minds because every month something new was coming out in the media that we could explore, that we wanted to explore.
Mhm.
So how do you hold the fact that you have to finish a film? You have to cut the cord at some point or another. But I think we were able to really rely on certain things that don't
Mhm.
change, right? That we all need to be seen, and we all need role models. And what does it mean when all you've ever seen is deeply
Mhm.
distorted and dehumanizing? And what does that mean to you? And what does that mean to how the world is going to treat you? And that is still yet to be, that's still an ongoing conversation. And even when we see these sort of glamorized images, that are kind of, that maybe are talked about as positive, and there could be arguments for that. um, besides Veneno, I don't know if you've seen this yet. It's a film, it's a series out of Spain that I think is doing something I've never seen done before, and I'm
Mhm.
very excited about Veneno. But otherwise, a lot of the images we've been seeing in the past few years are still really curated and glamorized, and I do worry that they undermine the urgency of what's going on, in the government and in material
Mhm.
ways of trans lives, right? It's like we might enjoy and celebrate the glamour on the screen, but we still have to do the work to support trans lives off the screen. And that was the paradox I was struggling with, the whole time. And that was sort of the crux of the drive of the film.
Yeah, and so much of the film is centered around a lot of this archival film and television material that you went through, such depths with, really covering over 100 years of cinema. And I know that at one point you had about 1,000 film and TV titles that were part of your overall list from all of the research that came together. But I was really interested in how working with the participants of the documentary, that kind of ended up informing a lot of the choices of what ended up in the film content wise. And if it was something where you were having conversations with them in advance about what they had personal connections to or what had really kind of struck them in terms of character representation that they wanted to have a discussion about in a discourse as part of the movie.
It was also happening at the same time.
Mhm.
It was definitely this intricate dance. I assumed there'd be a book on the topic when I
Mhm.
started. Like Celluloid Closet was based on the research of Vito
Mhm.
Russo's tome, and this incredible resource, but there was nothing on
Yeah.
this issue. And so I had to do all the primary research before anything
Mhm.
else. So the first 3 years were focused entirely on curating and harnessing this mountain of archival footage, right? Canvassing over 100
Mhm.
years of material with this very specific lens. And so figuring out how to shape and structure that narrative became a puzzle in itself that we were doing in real time. And so as I was, building this archive, I'm having conversations with my friends, the people you see in the film. Most of the people you see are people I've been in
Yeah.
conversation with and intersecting with, either socially or with work in some way or another for many, many years.
Mhm.
And we're having these conversations, and I am trying to find out what is important to everybody. Like, what is the history they want to tell? What are the touchstones they want to bring out? So, and then, just naturally, I would share some of the research I had found. And so it was this ongoing conversation. But I did want it to be, I did want the film to be based in personal anecdotes, right? That's what we remember when we watch. We remember the personal stories. We remember that human connection. Like after spending an hour and a half watching 30 trans people share their stories, you feel like you know them, right? You feel, and it's those personal stories rather than the theory or the statistics that change you, that really start to shift the way you see the world. And so relying on those personal stories was how we structured the film. And because so many of the stories were divergent, right? There is no monolithic trans experience. And so that's where we're able to build like the tension, right, of this sort of this very human reckoning of history, of a drama. And that's how we were able to build sort of the ups and downs and the joy and the pain and the laughter and crying. And so constantly going back to the personal anecdotes was our approach. You know, and rather than a chronological way of telling the film, you know, I wanted to show that past and present really folds in on itself, you know, and that's where, again, leaning on the personal stories allowed us to move through time and cover the history, but not do it in this sort of, in this typical chronological way when you're looking at a history of representation.
Yeah. And I love that you're bringing up that point about how there is no monolithic trans experience within the community, and it's very different for everybody. And I think that's also one of the things that you do so well in the film is you really capture so many different cross sections of the industry. You know, you look at Sandra Caldwell, who's been in the entertainment industry for decades, and her experience is going to be very different to MJ Rodriguez, who's been in the industry more recently and had slightly different experiences. You know, you talk about trans masculinity erasure, you know, the difference for people of color within the community. And one thing that we see so frequently with films that are speaking about marginalized communities is that they can be asked to represent everybody. But this film really feels like it creates such a broad section of conversations within the community, which, you know, there's a lot of work that's gone into that and a lot of thoughtfulness behind it. So I wanted to ask about throughout the filmmaking process, how you really kind of consciously worked to make sure that was going to be the case at every single moment with the film and with the conversations that you were having, and not just the interviews, but the larger discourse that you bring into those conversations.
I mean, first off, there's so much more that we needed to talk about that we could have talked about. There could be a 5-part series. You know, I am actually pitching more of a series so that I can cover more of these issues. But I think, you know, going back to your point, that what I love most about trans people is that we do live at the intersections of every possibility that a human trait can have, right? We're every race, every class, every gender, every ability, religion, nationality, immigration status, age, ethnicity, right? More and more and more. And that, you know, that intersection of our history is there on screen, right? That it can't be ignored. And so it just, you know, to not have that be part of the film throughout, that would be an intentional act of erasure, you know? So it was there, and it was there to be explored.
Yeah. And then I was really fascinated by the research process beyond just looking at archival material, because you spent 2 or 3 years just fully researching yourself and looking at, you know, articles written that were reviews of movies that came out at the time, and going to different kind of cultural centers and museums and spaces like that before you got the opportunity to raise the money to bring on some research assistants. And so I wanted to ask about the way in which those moments beyond just you know, the footage from film and TV shows that you were looking at was really important to the conversation, and what kind of really informed the narrative voice of the film, and also what those research assistants were able to help you achieve that you hadn't necessarily been able to kind of go into and dive into as much yourself because you're just one person once you had that extra perspective.
First of all, your research is so good. I feel like this could be the last interview I ever do, because you've just like touched on everything I've ever said, which is great. Thank you. I'm so flattered. I would love to have you help me with research at some point. I knew from the beginning that I had to bring in as many voices as possible, because documenting a history is really ethically precarious. Like, we know that, right? When we study history, and then when we look at different perspectives and we understand, you know, the complications of who gets to tell and who's not telling, and who creates an archive and who's left out of an archive. So from the beginning, when I realized that I was going to have to create the primary document to then base the film on, from the beginning, I did research interviews, right? And that was me and my backpack of, you know, my small camera equipment, and traveling around the country, talking to trans people who had worked on one side of the camera, the other. And a lot of those interviews look like what has ended up in the film. Obviously, it was shot much nicer for the film. It wasn't just me and my rig that was 6 feet high. But, you know, it was through those interviews that that I really understood the lens of the film, you know, and what was so unique about a trans lens. And that was really where the beauty, it's like, politics aside, that beauty and that unique experience, that singular experience of a trans lens, and singular is a weird word to use because there is no singular experience, but a lens that has not really been talked about before. It's been talked about in different ways, but we haven't understood it through the trans perspective. And like what I'm thinking about in particular is like Laverne's story about Yentl. And that was one of the first stories she shared with me at one of our first meetings. And when she started talking about Yentl and how she really identified with Barbara Streisand, I didn't know where she was going with that. You know, at first I knew she like had a predilection for Jewish men. So I was like, oh, it's because you like Jewish men, right? And she's like, she got very serious. She's like, no, I really identified with Yentl because, and this is her speaking, she was saying, you know, I identified as a girl, as a little girl that nobody saw as a little girl at the time, right? Just the way that Yentl was just, you know, look, people thought she was a boy, but she was, she wanted her love interest to see the woman she was. And that's what Laverne was identifying with. She was like, people saw me as a little boy, but I was a little girl. And so she was that, it's like those moments that I was like, oh, that's more of what a trans lens is than like, and like having to find ourselves in like the most unusual, unlikely places. You know, and it's so simultaneously, you know, heartbreaking and beautiful, right? The lengths to which we go to survive and to see ourselves is so bittersweet. And you know, it's interesting to look at, you know, the history and the evolution of these sort of characters that are transgressing gender expectations on one level, but then to kind of get to this this other side, the underbelly of what it's like for a trans person. That to me was the most exciting part of the research.
Yeah. I also really wanted to talk about the way that you built your crew, and you made such a specific effort to hire a trans crew, and where you couldn't, you created a mentorship program where you would hire someone who was cis, but they would have to mentor someone from the trans community who didn't have that experience yet. And I just thought that was such a stunning thing. And especially because the mentorship program also paid the mentees as well. So gave them like valuable experience, but also paid them for the opportunity of gaining that experience. And even within the interviews, the fact that you would ask the mentees, like, are there any questions that you think would be important for us to ask in the interview? And so wanted to ask about whether there were moments in the film that developed because of those conversations, giving them a platform and giving them a voice and giving them the opportunity to put forth their questions from their personal experience as well.
That's such a great question. You know, it was so crucial that the film modeled the change that it wants to see, right? You know, and like you're saying, Disclosure was unique in that it relies on trans people in front of the camera to be the experts of their own lives, because who's better an expert of a life than the one who's living it? But it was also essential that that behind the screen, behind the camera too, that it was all trans people informing the story, right? So like, as you said, we prioritized hiring trans people. When we couldn't, we mentored trans people. And, you know, it informed the story, I think, in this emotional tone that you feel throughout, right? Because for so many of the people we interviewed, they're so often the only trans person in a room, on a set, you know, whether, or, you know, anywhere in their life, right? We tend to, you know, when it's pretty often, especially in the professional world, unless you create your own set of only trans people. But I think, you know, there are these moments when people, I specifically remember like Lily Wachowski, right? Lily Wachowski, you know, of the Matrix fame, she never does interviews. And we had developed a friendship because I knew her boyfriend for a very long time, this trans guy named Mickey, who I've known for a very long time. And when they got together, you know, he was like, I really want you to meet Lily. And so we became friends, and I asked her to be in the film. And because we had that friendship, she agreed. But she was not comfortable at first, you know, and you could see, you know, she's kind of walking up, looking around. And then I kind of saw that moment of recognition where she realized everyone she was looking at was trans. And then suddenly you see the change in her, in her body language, in her face. You know, she became so much more playful and just sort of kind of having, and then we kind of use a lot of shorthand, you know, words and jokes and just the ease of that conversation where, you know, the people listening get it in a way that you just might not if you're not experiencing it yourself. And I think that intimacy really translates to the film, and it really translates to the watch when you're watching. And so as a viewer, whether you're trans or cis, you're feeling a connection. Like these are your friends who are kind of just sharing their life, some life experiences with you. And I'm not sure we could have achieved that, those moments that have become part of every frame without prioritizing trans people
Mhm.
behind the scenes.
Yeah. But also to your point about how, especially within the industry, unless you create that environment yourself, you very frequently are the only person who is trans on any sort of film set. What was that like emotionally for you the first day when you walked onto set, and that was the experience for you as well as a director, and how did that also help you overall throughout the experience with that intimacy that you had as a director with the crew that you got the opportunity to work with on this?
I mean, it was simultaneously like I was filled with pride, and it was like I was at the playground as a kid. You
Mhm.
know, it was like I just wanted to run around with everyone and joke and make things and gossip, and also was so proud of this thing we had built. You know, I I I had left many jobs because I didn't feel comfortable, you know,
Mhm.
and it might have even been before I was out publicly, but I could just, there'd be transphobia, you know, transphobic
Mhm.
comments, like unintentional, but like people don't know what they don't know. And then as I started to kind of come out more publicly, just the misgendering and the lack of any sort of overt allyship or bathrooms, it's draining, and it really distracts you from doing your job and from building your career and from learning. And so, you know, and so seeing that juxtaposition of just not only for myself, of being in
Mhm.
an environment where I knew I wasn't going to have to deal with those things, and then seeing my peers get to
Mhm.
experience that freedom too. You know, one of my friends who I've known for about 20 years, he came on as our digital imaging technician, and he had been at a point in his career where he'd been working on a lot of television shows, but he just felt like just bummed out because he
Mhm.
wasn't connecting to the other people, and he felt there really wasn't a place for him, and he was going to maybe move on to a different career. And then he worked on set kind of as a favor to me, because I was like, listen, you're great at what you do, I want you there, would you consider it? I knew he had one foot out the door, but he was like, all right, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like he was convinced very quickly. And he told me like it completely changed his approach, right?
Mhm.
And he like went back into the industry and blossomed.
Yeah.
And hearing that many times like was just like, that's all it takes, right?
Mhm.
Giving a person this one experience of feeling centered on a set, of what it means to feel like, oh, you're not alone, that your
Mhm.
voice matters, that you have a lot to contribute, that can change the trajectory of their career, of their life.
Yeah.
So kind of feeling the seeds of that on set, you could feel it.
Mhm.
Was life changing.
Yeah. And it also, sounds like there was a lot of specific thought behind the environment as you were conducting these interviews and the space that you were creating. If you look at when Jen tells that really, really beautiful story about watching Caitlyn Jenner's TV series and how that really, in an unexpected way, changed the way that she saw how others viewed her, but also how she viewed herself and hadn't allowed herself certain admiration and love because of it. And I heard that after she shared that story, that everyone on set just kind of paused for a few minutes and gave a little bit of breathing space rather than just like trying to ask the next question and get another response where there was going to be that emotion. So were there also other moments where people were sharing really intimate details, because people are sharing a lot of personal information and sometimes trauma. And so were there other moments throughout the making of the film as well where there were kind of just like these pauses within the space that you were creating just to make sure that it continued to feel like the environment that you had wanted and so consciously set up for everybody?
Wow, I love that point, and it makes me think. I hadn't thought about that in the sense of, again, how I
Mhm.
think having people who intimately understand your experience be
Mhm.
there, right? Be in front of the curtain,
Mhm.
giving you their full attention. And it just, this subtle shift of being looked at or looked with, right?
Mhm.
Right. When we're watching films, are we looking at somebody? Or are we experiencing this with them? And I think that's, again, something we feel in the making, right? And so I can't help but think about, would that sort of, would those emotional moments, would those visceral experiences have been different had it not been all trans people who were experiencing it together, and that energy that you feel, you know, that energy is very different when it's someone who's sort of like feeling bad for you, right? Like maybe it's pity, or, but there's still a disconnect. But when you're experiencing this thing together, that connection is so palatable. And I think that definitely translates to screen. And they were constant, you know, there were moments, you know, there were a few people that, you know, ended up not being in the film for one reason or the other. And this one woman whose name I'm going to leave out just to protect her privacy, you know, she shared some devastating stories, you know, and to the point where she was really shaken up on set. And we all had to kind of take a full, like probably an hour away, you know, just to kind of deal with that trauma that she, you know, experienced and shared. You know, and you know, maybe if we weren't all trans people, we would have kind of jumped right back in, you know, the show must go on. But it unearthed something in all of us that couldn't be denied. I'm trying to think of other experiences where I mean, I think this, you know, there's those moments of levity like that also kind of carried us through in ways. There's moments of excitement, of discovery. Too, I'm thinking about like talking about Bugs Bunny, like nobody saw that coming, right? And then it came up twice, you know, with both Susan Stryker and Lily Wachowski talking about how Bugs Bunny was like, you know, Bugs Bunny in a dress, like kind of was a hero for them. Like, and that everyone was just, you know, just so delighted by these realizations. Or, you know, for like the history nerds, when Susan Stryker talked about the trans body in 1913 that we see in the D.W. Griffith moment, you know, both Laverne and I would just gasp at these moments, like, oh, how exciting to know that we were there in the beginning, and then to explore the larger implications of race and gender. You know, those moments were just kind of like being in an ocean of experience where you're just pulled in every direction and you're loving every moment of it. Those are so precious.
Yeah. And then in terms of the funding and working with participants in the film, I wanted to talk a little bit about that, because I think one of the really interesting things that you did when you were going out for financing was not to work with backers who wouldn't jump onto a documentary where participants were being paid because they felt like it could compromise the integrity of the film, because it was really important to you to pay honorariums to everybody who came and like shared their experience, but also their expertise that they uniquely have and nobody else could offer to this film. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about that journey in terms of like working with financiers and working with backers, but also making sure that you were really preserving the integrity of the film for the participants that were going to take part in it with you.
You know, there were moments where it was so excruciating to have to explain why I felt that was important. But in the end, when I realized that how intimate it is to make a film, and everyone you're working with feels a stake in it, and everyone feels a personal stake in it, right? And that's beautiful, and that's that's something I love about filmmaking. It's the most collaborative art practice I've ever partaken in. And you know, I'm not sure that's a word, partaken in, but you know what I mean. And so I wasn't trying to convince people of what I thought was right and wrong. You know, I would present how we were making this film. And if there was pushback, I understood they weren't the right partner for us, you know? And it took a long time to find the right partners, but now they've been with us every step of the way. And it's hard. It's hard to make a film, but you get to choose where you put your energy and your intention and the choices you make and the story you want to tell for the rest of your life about that film and about the making of it. And knowing that everyone who's now part of our team so believes in this process. And it's a process that I believe will only enhance the industry of documentary filmmaking. And not everyone agrees with me on that, but I believe it is so important to compensate people for their time. They are the experts of their own lives, people who are sharing their stories. And the power dynamic of filmmaker and protagonist is one that at the end of the day, the filmmaker has a product, right? This is whether it gets sold to Netflix or, you know, never gets seen, you have something you've made. This is cultural capital. And for the person who's been so vulnerable to share their image and their story to not be compensated in any way, I find really problematic and offensive. And so, not only are we talking about, often documentarians are going into marginalized communities when maybe someone is turning down a job in order to work with you on your film, right? That in itself is something that you have to compensate people for their time. I can go on and on about this issue. I think I've lost a little track of your initial question, but compensating people for their time is integral to the kind of films I want to make. To where the film is speaking to so many of the injustices in our society and trying to do right by it in the making of it. And we get to choose where we put our energy, and that is a choice that I've made throughout my whole career.
Yeah. And in terms of the post-production and the editing process, obviously with documentary film, so much of it comes together in post-production. And that's kind of very much like a directorial choice every single day in the edit room, because there's such a vast amount of footage. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how much the film continued to evolve and shift and change, because you were still even taping an interview 6 weeks before you premiered at Sundance. So there was still new footage and new perspectives coming in right down to the wire.
Yeah, securing talent we had such a long list of interviews. We flew people in from all over the world. For some, it took years of back and forth scheduling. Like Angelica Ross is the one I talk about quite often, because I've known her for years and I wanted her from the beginning. I really wanted her to have a bigger role in the film because she is brilliant. She has so much to say. She has so much knowledge. But at the end of it, we couldn't secure her interview until 6 weeks before we premiered. So that was hard, but the film is bookended by the paradox that you and I were talking about early on in the film, early on in this interview, of that tension of a celebratory increase of visibility and the fear around a rise of violence, right? Because whenever a marginalized community gets mainstream attention, backlash ensues. And that was what made me want to make this film, was that moment when Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time magazine in June 2014. I was so excited about her getting, her personally, the podium that she would be on, and the voice that she would now have. I knew she would shed light to so many of the crucial issues, but I was also really concerned about what this, increase of attention would do to the community. And so that was when I knew I wanted to make the film. And that's really what bookends the film. Like we see that in the first 5 minutes and in the last. And so using the history to address those stories was always our anchor. That was always the anchor. And everything kind of had to refer back to that tension. And so things didn't really, I think that is a tension and the nuance that's going to last for such a long time, that it really anchored us, and we were always able to bring the film back to that. And so things didn't really change in terms of our goals. I think what would change was just the puzzle, right? How do you put this history together? How do you fit in so many divergent views? How do you fit in so much nuance and not lose your way in telling the story? That was the puzzle we were constantly, finding ourselves in. And I think because our team was so aligned into the values and the ultimate goal of the story we were trying to tell, we were able to find our way. Our editor, had worked with archival footage many times before, and that was why I sought her out. And the first, I think, probably like maybe 6 weeks to 2 months, I was like, just go through the footage, get familiar with it, and organize it how you want to. And in that time, she kind of made these pods, right? And a lot of those pods you see throughout. And so seeing those pods and kind of seeing these themes and seeing the juxtaposition within those themes and the stories each of those pods could speak to off the screen and historically, and whether it was happening in real time and in real life, and what was still happening today that we saw 100 years ago. That's when we were able to start to connect the dots between all these pods and create the arc of, what does it mean to be in this moment of increased visibility and increased violence. and how does how does looking at that history inform that conversation?
Mhm. And with the journey of the film, obviously you had the opportunity to premiere in person at Sundance, and then there was obviously a vast shift, and everything's had to be virtual over the last several months as the film's continued its journey through playing festivals, having screenings, and being released. And so I kind of wanted to ask about the way in which you've continued to work on creating a conversation that goes beyond the time in which people spend watching the movie, and even down to social impact campaigning, and the way that if we didn't have this shutdown, you would have the opportunity to put together screenings for the trans community and to reach out to a lot of people who don't get the opportunity to access films like this all the time where they live, and how that's looked really, really different over the last 9 months in the journey of this film, and making sure that you can still reach the audiences that it's so vital for them to see this film, but also to create that larger conversation than just the movie itself.
Yeah, it was so exciting to
Mhm.
go to Sundance last January. I think we had the biggest trans takeover that Park
Mhm.
City's ever had. I think there was about 30 of us there. It was so exciting, so delightful. We had so much fun. The screenings just blew my mind.
Mhm.
And we rolled up our sleeves. We were ready to travel the world, and then yes, everything shut down. And so kind of figuring out in real time very quickly how we were going to roll out this film was terrifying. And, you know, but we understood there was such an urgency and timeliness of the story, right? Looking at the ways in which trans people have been denied humanity on screen helps you understand so much of the violence and stigma against trans people, right? We experience discrimination disproportionately to the rest of the LGBT community, right? When you look at the homicide rate in the LGBT community, 40% has been towards trans women of color, specifically Black trans women, right? And trans unemployment is 3 times the rate of general population. For trans people of color, it's 4 times the rate of national unemployment. 50% of trans people report attempting suicide at some point in their lives, and that's compared to 4.6 of the general population, right? So that's why it's so important for people to start asking themselves why they have these preconceived ideas about trans people, right? Are they based on reality? Like, do they serve to bring you closer to trans people? And so our impact campaign has addressed these issues head on. And so we were able to start that campaign, you know, at the right when we were supposed to have these screenings, right? So for instance, I think one of our first screenings was going to be hot docs. I'm losing track of time, whether it was hot docs or Tribeca. It was early in the spring.
Mhm.
And so those days that we were supposed to have those screenings, we brought together people in those and local trans people. Sorry, that didn't come out right. We brought together people in the community. So for instance, in New York, we brought together trans folks in New York who were responding to COVID, right? And we had them come and have what we were doing disclosure chats. So Laverne would be in conversations with people in New York about what was happening with COVID and how disclosure could be used to further their conversations, to further the work they were doing. So we were using the platform we had built to address real issues in real time for trans people. And we've continued to do this, right? Our film has been used to educate lawyers and judges about the bias they might have towards trans people who come into the courtroom. Like, clips have been shared in community of lawyers and judges. Like that, when I heard that, that just blew my mind. And now we're creating toolkits for other lawyers and judges to use to further these conversations. Again, the conversations that have been had across the country in university classrooms, in high school classrooms, using the film and using toolkits we've created. It have just the impact of that, the domino effect of that. Even the impact we saw early on was from our production model. One of our first shoots was in January 2018, and on set was this woman named Desi, and she was a gaffer, and she had never worked with trans people, though she felt herself to be an ally, a cis lesbian, sort of part of the community, but had never actually been in proximity to working with trans people. She was so moved by what she was learning and experiencing on set that she went back to her tech union, IATSE, which is the largest tech union in the world, and instituted the first trans sensitivity training, because she couldn't fathom what it would be like for new trans members, like to enroll and be part of the union. And that sensitivity training has now been given across the country to tens of thousands of, of union members. So the impact started then, and we're still seeing it now. I mean, I've been going to diversity and inclusion trainings to organizations and corporations like Fidelity and Spotify and even Netflix, right? Using our experiences from disclosure, what we're seeing on screen and how we made it to share, to share with these corporations, to talk about how they can streamline their HR, for trans people. And what are the questions people need to ask themselves, right? It's not just about saying, yes, of course, we're equal opportunity, trans people should apply. Like, no, you actually have to make it welcoming to trans people. You have to show trans people that they're welcome. It's like, I often say, like, you want to have a party, you invite people to your party. You don't just say, I'm having a party and expect people to show up, right? You send out invitations. You tell people you want them there. You ask them, what food do they like? What drinks do they want? And like, how do we translate that to the workplace? Like, how do we show trans people that there is a safe and equitable office for you to work in? And these are the conversations that we're having. And that's been incredibly meaningful and exciting.
Yeah. Well, it's such a fantastically crafted film, and congratulations on everything with it. And I hope nothing but continued success with these conversations and with these actual changes that are coming into place from it, and hope that we get to see the miniseries that you've been working on as well. And thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you, Mara. So nice speaking with you.